Joined by Mehdi Hasan, political editor of the New Statesman. Hello, Mehdi, thanks for joining us. It was inevitable, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was inevitable. I think some of us had warned a few months ago that they probably will get rid of him when the time is right, when no one's looking. They couldn't get rid of him when the New York Times piece emerged in November, which kicked off the whole row again. They waited for the right time, but I'm not sure this is the right time. They're now being attacked, rightly so, for announcing his resignation on the same day that Tony Blair's in front of the Chilcot inquiry.
Why get rid of him when the common view is that he was doing quite a good job at number 10?
Well, whether he was doing a good job at number 10 or not is not the point. The point is how big a story is the News of the World hacking story. And it gets bigger and bigger by the week. More and more celebrities seem to roll out of bed and take legal action against News of the World as we go. And we've got the Crown Prosecution Service now announcing that they're going to have a full review of the police evidence. We've got several Labour people like John Prescott and Lib Dems like Brian Paddock taking a judicial review of Scotland Yard. There's all sorts of civil cases going through the courts. And the more and more cases that emerge, the more and more allegations that emerge, the more and more Andy Coulson's the story. And he's a spin doctor. He's not supposed to be the story, as he himself pointed out in his statement today.
So nothing to do with the turf war between him and the policy advisor, Steve Hilton?
Well, I suppose that may have played a role in exacerbating his own position at the moment. David Cameron's attitude, we saw just now in that interview of yours, which he gave to one of your people, suggests that probably wasn't the final case, because he's been defending him right down the line in recent days. He went on the Today programme to defend him. He refused to accept a resignation letter that we know Andy Coulson had offered more than a week ago. So whether there were turf wars between the so-called, Cameroonian Steve Hilton, who wants a kind of compassionate, cuddly conservatism, and Andy Coulson, who was brought in to really appeal to the tabloids and the working class Tories and the right of the party. Whether that played a role or not, we don't know. I suspect it's more a point of getting rid of him before the finger is levelled against him by authorities that he was involved in the hacking.
Not just about Andy Coulson, though, is it? It's about, presumably, David Cameron's judgment as well.
I think it is about David Cameron's judgment, not just David Cameron's judgment, George Osborne's judgment. The Chancellor is the man who persuaded David Cameron to hire Andy Coulson only 5 months after he had quit as News of the World editor. And there were a lot of people at the time, including Mr Cameron's cabinet colleague, Chris Huhne of the Liberal Democrats, who warned him at the time that Andy Coulson is either guilty of being involved in phone hacking, and if he didn't know about it and is not guilty, then he's guilty of being incompetent. Either way, he's not up to being Director of Communications of the Conservative Party and Director of Communications for the British government.
Prime Minister said at the time that everyone is entitled to a mistake. He said today that he's being punished twice for the same mistake. Do you agree?
No, I don't think so. I don't think he's been punished at all, in fact. The man quit as News of the World editor. The ludicrously weak Press Complaints Commission then cleared him and the News of the World. He then got hired by the leader of the opposition in a very well-paid job. I can't even say the word well-remunerated. And he's now quit again. He wasn't sacked by the government. And we don't know what actions are going to be taken by the Crown Prosecution Service or Scotland Yard, which have shown a great reluctance to investigate this story properly. It's been The Guardian and a couple of Labour MPs that have really pushed this.
Stand by for just a second, if you would, please, Mehdi, because I want to bring in, we've had a couple of comms errors, but we've got him now, John Rentoul, who is a commentator for The Independent on Sunday, also Tony Blair's biographer. Hi, John, I'm not sure how much you heard about what Mehdi was saying there, but basically it was bound to happen. Is now the right time?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think, in purely practical political terms, David Cameron was waiting to see how the story played out. The recent revelations that there were more people prepared to come forward to suggest that Andy Coulson was involved in phone hacking, or knew more about phone hacking than he previously admitted, meant that the story just wasn't going to go away, and so you've got to try and draw a line under it at this stage.
Yeah, but just in case his lawyers and our lawyers are watching, we still always need to point out that nothing has stuck against Mr Coulson yet, has it?
No, of course not. And, maybe nothing will. But the point is that it's become completely obvious in recent days and weeks that the story isn't going to go away, that it's going to carry on being an irritant. There may have been a hope at one stage that people would just back off and the story would die away, but it's just obviously not going to, and therefore, in practical political terms, kill it now. That's the thinking, and the opposition will rant on about David Cameron's judgment called into question, but I think once Andy Coulson's gone, he's gone. That's the end of the story.
I was about to ask you about that. The new Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, said over the last few weeks that Mr Coulson's role at the heart of government means the government's integrity is under question. You disagree?
Well, it's a bit over the top, isn't it? These stories keep coming and going. I mean, there are plenty of colourful stories about Ed Milibands, head of strategy and communications, too. I mean, he's had quite an entertaining past. But I mean, normally people get judged on the job they do, and most people accept that Andy Coulson was doing quite a good job. But in the end, this story was obviously going to be a continuing problem for the government, so they've decided to pull the plug on it.
Mehdi Hasan, double-edged sword, really, giving a journalist the job of head of communications at Downing Street.
It is. We saw that with Alistair Campbell, who was brilliant at the beginning, but towards the end kind of imploded over Iraq and David Kelly, etc. in spin. I think, as we've seen in recent weeks and recent months, we've heard so much about how David Cameron and his acolytes look up to Tony Blair. They see themselves as the heirs to Blair, and in that way, they also were the heirs to Alistair Campbell when they brought Andy Coulson, and they thought he could do for them what Alistair Campbell had done for New Labour, and his career has just imploded much faster than Alistair Campbell's did.
With that in mind, John Rentoul, who's next for head of communications?
I wouldn't want to guess. They need someone who understands the tabloid press, or what used to be called the tabloid press. Perhaps we call it the mass market press, because that was the unique thing that Alistair Campbell brought to the Blair government. It was what Andy Coulson brought to the Cameron government. So they need someone who understands that market, that kind of journalism. That's the basic requirement, and they need someone who, as Andy Coulson did by and large, is able to keep himself or herself out of the news themselves. I mean, Andy Coulson was only in the news for things he'd done before he was at Number 10. He was very rarely in the news for his activities at Number 10.
Mehdi, you wanted to come in there.
Sorry to make one very important point. One of the reasons Andy Coulson was hired and why George Osborne, William Hague pressed David Cameron to hire him was because of his excellent links with the Murdoch-owned press. They wanted to get the Sun away from Labour and all the papers away from Labour, which he succeeded in doing. But of course, getting those papers on side didn't help the Conservatives win a majority at the last election, did it?
Who do you think is going to be the next head of communications while you're there?
I have no idea, but the names that are going around are quite interesting. George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor of The Sun, another ex-Murdoch man. Ian Birrell, who is a former Cameron speechwriter, who, if he's hired, is very close to Steve Hilton, so that would upset some of the Tory right and maybe some of the tabloids, but we just don't know. I'm assuming they want someone who's going to last a full parliamentary term.
We'll see. Thanks very much indeed, gentlemen. What do you think? Who would do a good job? News at sky.com, 8450. Perhaps one of those two gentlemen. What do you think? Still to come, the sport with John, including Roger Federer in action at the Aussie Open Tennis. That's to come.